This week's Technique Tuesday video is a continuation of my series on basic sweater styles. Today we'll look at the raglan. In this video, you'll learn how the raglan sweater differs from the previous styles we've looked at in this series. I'll explain the basic shaping of a raglan sweater and then explore the various ways fit can be improved. I'll also show you examples of actual raglan sweaters and discuss the construction elements that affect their fit. Throughout this series, I have talked about how a sweater style is defined based on what is going on between the underarm and the neck. How the body and the sleeves are shaped and how they're joined together is what allows us to say this is a drop shoulder sweater, this is a modified drop shoulder sweater, this is a set-in sleeve sweater. Today we're going to talk about raglan sweaters. So it isn't just that a raglan sweater is shaped differently between the underarm and the neck, and so therefore it gets a different label for the type of sweater style it is. The raglan sweater is fundamentally different from these types of sweaters because it is a yoke style sweater. With these types of sweaters, we have armholes that are vertical, and we have shoulder seams that join the front and the back together. Yoke style sweaters do not have shoulder seams, and the body has shaping as well as the sleeve, so you don't get that vertical armhole the way that you do with these styles of sweaters. So here we have a schematic for the body of a raglan and then one of the sleeves. And what you see is you have these angled lines that go directly from the underarm all the way up to the neck opening. So if we look at the sweater on this little mannequin, what we can see is that we have 4 diagonal lines. We've got one here, and then on the back we have one here and one here as well. We call these seam lines, whether or not we are working in pieces or we are working seamlessly. Those are identified as the seam lines. And we have shaping on both sides of those seam lines in order to create the bodice of this style of sweater. One popular method of knitting a raglan is to knit it top down seamlessly in the round. What I have here is a raglan sweater that I have knit top down seamlessly, but I've not knit it completely in the round because I do have a V-neck shape. The most basic type of raglan sweater would be one where the front and the back are identical, and of course the 2 sleeves are identical as well. So if you were working top down, you'd cast on a number of stitches and join in the round. You have enough to fit around the neck, but also enough that will pull over your head. And then you just work in the round, and every other round you're going to do 8 increases, 1 on each side of each of the 4 seam lines. And you would just do that until you got down to the depth that you needed for your underarm. So that is the most basic raglan shape, and it will get you a sweater, but it will get you a sweater that may not fit very well. The problem with a sweater that is identical on the front and the back is that your neck is not symmetrical on your body. It does not come straight up out of your shoulders. Instead, the back of your neck is in line with the tops of your shoulders, but the front of your neck is a couple of inches lower. So when you have a sweater that is exactly the same on the front and the back, in order for the sweater to sit up where it needs to be here at the neck, that's going to bring up the front of the sweater and it's going to hit you across the neck right here. There are a couple of approaches for improving the fit around the neck of a raglan sweater. One is to start it just as you would for a basic raglan, joining it in the round for a round neck. But you would work some short rows across the tops of the sleeves and across the back. You might do them at the very top of the neck. You might do them part way down the yoke, or you might do them after you have joined in the round for just the body. There's a couple of different ways that you can do your short rows, but the purpose of the short rows is to create vertical length on the part of the fabric that is being worked during the short rows. So if you're not working the front, when you're working short rows, you're just working across the sleeves and going back and forth a few times. That will keep the front of the body shorter, and it will allow the front of the neck to sit right here while it gives the length that you need to raise the back of the neck up. Another option would be to do what I've done with my little sample sweater, which is to create a shaped neck. So shaped necks is what we did in the previous 3 sweaters that we've seen in this series. Some were crew necks and some were V-necks, but you can do the same thing. So rather than joining in the round at the neck, you have just the sleeve over here, the back of the neck, the sleeve, and then you might have just a couple of the stitches that would be for the front. And so as you're working back and forth, you would do your shaping for the seam lines on right side rows, and then you would do the shaping that you needed for your neck until that was complete. And then you could join in the round and finish off your shaping down to the armholes. So this method will also allow the back of the neck to sit where it is, but will create this opening that is below the front of the neck so that the fit will be better. One of the issues that you can run into with the shaping rate is that if your row gauge is different from what the pattern expects, you can end up with an armhole that is too shallow or too deep. And you might need to adjust your shaping rate in order to end up with something that's the correct depth. So as an example, if we had a sweater where we had started with a neck that was 6 inches wide across the top, so we'd have 30 inches for the front piece, 30 for the back, and then we'd have a couple each on the sleeves. But the front would start with 30 stitches, and then every other round we're going to increase a stitch at each end of the body. By the time you get to where the underarms are supposed to be, you would have 88 stitches for the front. If you had 6.5 rows per inch, you'd end up with an armhole that was 9 inches deep. If you had more rows per inch than what the pattern stated, like if you had 7.5 rows per inch, you'd end up with an armhole that was 8 inches deep. So it would be 1/2 inch too short because you would have finished all your increases before you got to the final depth. If you had even more rows per inch, like 8 rows per inch, it would be only 7.5 inches deep. It could be a significant difference. So you might need to adjust by adding in a plain round here and there in order to extend the depth, or eliminate a plain round here or there in order to shorten the depth. So if your row gauge is different, you're going to need to look at that shaping rate. An issue with working your shaping at this really consistent rate all the way from the neck to the armhole is that your body doesn't necessarily change at a constant rate. And so there are some approaches to raglans that achieve a better distribution of the shaping. And one of those is called a compound raglan, so that the increases, if you're working top down, are done a little bit faster near the top, and then they're done more slowly as you come down, and then again faster as you get down to the bottom. So it's more of an S-shaped curve, and it reflects how bodies typically change shape between the neck and the underarm more closely. So in addition to addressing the fact that your body changes shape at different rates as you're heading away from the neck, and you might need to change that in order to accommodate that a little bit better, another issue is that you may not need the same amount of additional fabric in each of the pieces. So the way that raglans are constructed, even if you're changing the shaping rate, is the idea is you're still doing them at the same time in all of these places along the seam lines. And you may actually find that you might want more stitches for your sleeves or less stitches for your sleeves than what you're going to end up with. And you may find that you need more stitches for the front front of your body than you need for the back. So you may end up finding that you need to calculate different shaping rates for the sleeves than you have for the body, and you may need a different shaping amount and rate for the front than you need for the back. And in that case, you might consider not trying to do it seamlessly, but instead do it in pieces, and so that you only have to keep track of the shaping rate that you have for the piece that you're working on. So you do the calculations that you need for each of the pieces, and then work them separately, and then seam them together later. Aran sweaters, anything that's heavily cabled, is going to have more stitches, and therefore the fabric is going to be heavier than if you are working in something that's plain stockinette. Working this sweater in pieces and then seaming provides some structure along those seam lines to help the sweater stay together. When you work seamlessly, the sweater can stretch equally in all directions, and it may not fit well at the shoulders or the neck. You may find if it's a heavier weight sweater that it stretches out. So this has an opening in the front. It's a placket so that it will sit up at the shoulders and not choke the child who's going to be wearing it. This is a 1950s Raglan jacket that I knit as part of my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade. This fits me great. I don't have any issues with it sliding or off my shoulders or stretching out, anything like that. So this one fits me really well. This is the sweater that I'm wearing in this video. So this sweater calls for a bulky weight yarn, and the yarn that is specified in the pattern has a chainette construction, which allows it to have twice as much yardage per 100 grams than you'd see in a standard plied yarn of this yarn weight. So that helped really lighten up how heavy the sweater was going to be. Many necklines these days are quite wide. I noticed that it was just stretching so far across my shoulders that I was barely getting any of the shawl collar effect. It was just too wide. When it was laying flat, the dimensions were correct. It was that it was stretching out when I was wearing it. So that's an issue that you can get with a seamlessly knit raglan with a wide neck, is that there's no structural support in there to keep it from just stretching wide. And then it had this contemporary wide neck as well. I did a couple of things to help keep the neckline structured in this with this construction. I used a slip stitch crochet across the back to keep that back in place, and I did some slip stitch crocheting along the inside of the sweater, along the seam lines as well, just to keep that in its place. You want to watch out for how heavy the fabric actually is, whether or not you might need seams or some sort of structural support. And the wider the neck, the more likely it is to want to stretch and slide down your arms. Basic raglans and drop shoulder sweaters are both easy to knit, and either sweater type can be a good starting point for first-time sweater knitters. Getting a great fit requires the use of more complex shaping and addressing the best way to adjust the sweater for your own body shape and fit issues. That takes time to learn, but it can be learned. If you have questions about how to make adjustments to your sweaters to achieve a better fit, you can leave those down in the comments below. You can see the growing playlist for this series over here, and if you want to see how I added structure to this raglan sweater after I finish knitting it, you might be interested in this video over here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.